right, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Catalina Posada. I'm a senior from Princeton University, and today I'll be talking to you about my research regarding the criminalization of opioid use during pregnancy and the impacts that that has on all women's access to addiction treatment. So before I begin with the rest of my presentation, there's a couple of important terms that I want to define. The first of them being punitive policies. I'll also be calling them PPs. And these are any state policy which characterizes substance abuse during pregnancy as child abuse and warrants punishment such as termination of parental rights, civil commitment, and in severe cases, incarceration. PPs were largely passed in response to a surge in opioid use disorder, or OUDs, among pregnant women in the US in the last 2 decades. The second important term is medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, and this has been found to be the most effective treatment for substance use disorder, SUD, and OUDs. And MAT with buprenorphine or methadone is effective and completely safe for both the mother and the fetus when it's a pregnant woman taking this medication. However, now with a new federal amendment, if detected in the infant bloodstream, depending on a state's interpretation of this federal amendment, which I'll talk about in more detail, these medication-assisted treatment substances can now trigger punitive policies. The third important term is a priority treatment program, or a PTP, and these are policies that require treatment facilities to treat pregnant women populations as priority populations such that they have a higher likelihood of being admitted and receiving treatment for their OUDs or SUDs. So why is it important to study the impacts of criminalization of substance use during pregnancy? Mainly because it's highly related to a big public health concern in the US, which is the opioid epidemic. Given that the opioid epidemic, claims approximately 80,000 American lives per year and inflicts an economic toll of about $1.5 trillion a year, it's a critical public health concern whose dynamics warrant exploration. Secondly, there have been recent changes to federal law regarding punitive policies. The Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, or CARA, was passed in 2016 to address the rising impact of the opioid epidemic, particularly in mothers and infants. And this new revision to CARA allows states to redefine what qualifies as substance abuse-related child abuse, such that now drugs that are used for medication-assisted treatment can also be among the substances that, if detected in an infant's blood, can trigger a punitive policy. The third motivation is that there's concerns as to the efficacy of punitive policies. Several scholars have warned that there's no proven benefits in terms of maternal or infant health, and that punitive policies may actually just serve to be a deterrent for pregnant women, limiting their participation in OUD treatment programs. And fourth, there's big glaring knowledge gaps about the interactions between PPs and PTPs when they're active in the same state. And also little is known about the impacts that state-level punitive policies have on the behavior and treatment of non-pregnant women, so on populations that are outside of the scope of their target population. Guiding my research moving forward, I had two main questions. I was interested in assessing in states that had punitive policies, will fear act as a deterrent to expectant mothers in the pursuit of addiction treatment? Could this reduce the demand for addiction treatment? And secondly, how will punitive policies impact the prevalence of MAT use for all women of childbearing age, which I define as women less than 40 years of age? So just contextualizing the policy landscape, because it can be pretty complex within each state, reiterating that the CARA Act of 2016 expanded the definition of an abused child such that infants who tested positive for any drug, not just illegal substances in their blood sample, could trigger a punitive policy, and that could qualify as substance abuse-related child abuse. What I'm showing you in the table to the right is that there's big variations in each state as to whether they implement a punitive policy and when they do. In the penultimate column, that's the punitive policy effective year section, and we see that there's variation, and some states don't implement punitive policies, some do. When they do, some implement before 2004, others post 2018, so there's a big range there. And there's also a variation in if states have a priority treatment program. So that's the last column. Some states have both. And so these dynamics warrant exploration. 4 previous studies in this field served as the cornerstones during the conceptualization stage of my project, but today I really only want to focus on the last 2. Walter in 2023 found that 3,700 women with only MAT substances in their systems were reported by hospitals to their respective states for having committed child abuse. And so these are not women who are abusing illegal drugs or abusing opiates. They're just simply taking their medication for opioid for their OUD. And then the fourth study here is the Atkins Endurance in 2020, and they used TEDS-A data, which I also use, so I'll be explaining that shortly. And they find that states that adopt punitive policies saw pregnant admissions drop by 29%, but they only looked from the time period of 2000 to 2014. And in my study, what I'm going to do differently is I'm extending this analysis into the post-2016 CARA period, so after this amendment. And I'm also going to be considering the impacts that punitive policies have on MAT. So MAT planned at intake for all women of childbearing age, not just pregnant women. Great. Okay, so in terms of my data, I'm using the TEDS-A, which is an admissions panel data set from 2013 to 2020. I'm interested in the effect that the presence and effective dates of punitive policies have on two outcome variables of interest: the proportion of admitted pregnant women out of a sample of women less than 40 years old, and secondly, the proportion of childbearing aged women that have MAT planned at admission out of that same sample. In my models, I include individual level demographic controls such as gender, race, ethnicity, education level, et cetera. And I also control for policy landscape covariates, because as I've mentioned, the policy landscape is very complex. So I account for dummies for a state having an active PTP, the state's Medicaid expansion status, less than 5 opioid treatment programs or OTPs per million inhabitants in a state, which is a marker of having low resource and program availability in a state, and the fourth being OTPs decreasing over time in a state. And so these policy landscape covariates were really vital for me to include as controls in my models, because they uniquely interplay with and mediate the PPs by kind of leveraging resource availability, both in funding and the MAT substances that are available. In terms of my sample, it's a sample of childbearing age women less than 40 years old that have used opiates as their primary substance. This sample is largely white, with the vast majority of the women not having attended college or either unemployed or not in the labor force. So the women in this study can be characterized on the whole as attaining lower levels of education and failing to participate significantly in the labor force. So later on in this presentation, when we're assessing the impacts of punitive policies, we should conceptualize those as impacts that are mostly felt by poor women. In terms of the outcomes of interest, a PP is active in 43.1% of the sample, and about half of the time that a PP is active, it is active in isolation. More specifically, 47.9% of the time it's active in isolation, and what that means is that there's no concurrently active PTP at that time in that state. PTPs, meanwhile, are active in 38.2% of the sample, and both policies are active in 22.5% of the sample, with MAT planned at intake at a prevalence of about 35%. So when we first look at the trends, first in pregnant admissions from 2013 to 2020, we see marked differences between no active punitive policy states, which are the solid blue lines, and the states that do have active punitive policies, the dashed red line. Particularly in the first plot, I want to highlight a big drop from 2017 to 2019 in the proportion of admitted pregnant women in active punitive policy states. Then looking at the figure to the right, this is the percentage of MAT planned at intake over that same time period. And what's interesting is that in these active punitive policy states, we see that the post-2016 period is characterized by a stagnation in MAT planned at intake, kind of plateauing at that 30% mark. Whereas states that don't have active punitive policies, they keep increasing their MAT planned at intake, reaching about 60% of the sample by the end in 2020. So these are differences, and they help motivate the study, and they kind of guide future expectations. However, we need a more specific or sophisticated assessment, statistical assessment, to really ascertain what's going on here. And so I developed a model, which is a difference in difference model, to account for the differential timelines of interpretation of my treatment or my punitive policy. And how I want everyone to think about this is that it's one model that is going through two different rounds of regressions. In the first round of regression, I am going to omit my interaction term. So that's the term in red, and I'm setting phi equal to 0. So we're just ignoring that. And in the first round, then, I'm assessing the impact that a punitive policy has when it's active in a state at that time for that individual on two outcomes of interest. And this is pregnant at admission or MAT planned at admission. The model also includes a vector X containing individual level controls and a vector Z containing those state level policy covariates that I've talked to you about. And it also has state and time fixed effects, just to make sure we're looking at within state, within time differences that can be, from our treatment effect. And then in the second round of regressions with the same model, we're going to incorporate that interaction term. So the red term in my model will become active. When we're looking at pregnant admissions at the outcome, phi will represent the condition when a state has no PTPs. So now this model will not only assess what the impact of a punitive policy does on pregnant admissions, it will also assess what a punitive policy does when it's active without a concurrent PTP there, and what those effects are on pregnant admissions. Then when MAT planned at intake is the outcome of interest, phi will represent a different interaction, which will be the condition when a state has less than 5 OTP per million inhabitants. And so that's supposed to model through the policy landscape of what is the effect of a punitive policy when it is active in a state with low treatment resources and programs. Next, I'm also going to employ an event study model because this will allow us to just assess the pre-treatment trends for both outcomes of interest. We want to make sure that the parallel trends assumption is being adhered to, so there's no underlying dynamics that are going on prior to treatment that are dictating our post-treatment timeframe. And so here I have the same two outcome variables of interest, but now we're incorporating a lag J and a lead K variable that indicate the number of years away from state-specific PP implementation for any given observation. Again, we include the vector of state and individual covariates and controls, and we also have state and time fixed effects. So this is to help justify and substantiate the diff and diff methodology, making sure we're adhering to parallel trends. And the results of this are, promising for the most part. For pregnant admissions and MAT planned at intake, which are these two figures respectively shown here, there were no pre-treatment trends witnessed in the 4 years prior to implementation, which is great. Parallel trends assumption adhered to, wonderful. But the fifth lead in both does fail to adhere to the parallel trend requirement. So this could be a limitation indicating loose parallel trends adherence. And for the sake of time, I'm going to leave it at that, but I welcome questions on this slide because I have thought through why that fifth lead may be, pulling away from the significance zone. So in terms of the first round of regressions, the first round, I'll remind you, is when we're completely ignoring the interaction term. And so we actually find counterintuitive findings when we're looking at pregnant admissions as the outcome. We see that PPs significantly increase the likelihood of pregnant admissions by about 0.56 percentage points. And PTPs decrease pregnant admissions by about 1.68 percentage points. Both of these are significant, and they are moving pregnant admissions in directions that are counterintuitive and opposite to expectations. So maybe this indicates that a model accounting for more complex interactions between these policies is better suited to understand the effect of each policy. Maybe we should be controlling for sequential implementation, which comes first, a PP or a PTP. Regardless, when we look at MAT use as the outcome variable, we see consistent findings that PPs reduce the likelihood of MAT planned at intake for all women of childbearing age by about 4.02 percentage points. Moreover, when we're looking at the effect of a priority treatment program on MAT, we see that it also increases MAT by 8.19 percentage points, both significant. So we do see a reduction in MAT use. And then when we go through the second round of regressions where we're incorporating the interaction term, we find interestingly that PPs in isolation actually reduce pregnant admissions by 1.29 percentage points. And this is significant. And it's important to remind ourselves that in about half of the time that a PP is active, it is active in isolation. So the dynamics of pregnant admissions are probably going to be guided by this negative coefficient in those cases. And the interaction term also exacerbates MAT reduction. And so in PPs, when we're looking at MAT as the outcome of interest, in PPs, when PPs are active in state times with less than 5 OTPs per million, it reduces the likelihood of MAT by 5.26 percentage points, which is an even higher increase than the original reduction. We also have to remind ourselves that this is the case in 45.2% of the time that a PP is active. It is active in a low resource, low program availability state. So our results indicate that interactions really do matter. So here I'm amending that first trends plot to show you in red the two respective interactions for pregnant admissions and for MAT use. And we see even higher degrees of suppression than what we originally saw in those initial trends when looking over time. And I also want to point out that critically, even without interactions, ever having a punitive policy significantly decreases the use of MAT. And so here, what I'm doing is I'm showing you the states on the left that have never had a PP and the states on the right that have had a PP and their prevalence of MAT planned at intake over time from 2013 to 2020. Highlighted in green are the states whose MAT prevalence has increased over time or whose prevalence is consistently above 50%. And in red are the ones who have very low MAT prevalence or declining MAT use over time. And so we can see just by looking at this that there's more green in the never PP and there's more red in the PP states. But in case this coloration fails to compel you, I'm also going to assess the means, which are statistically significantly different. And so the mean in the never PP state for MAT use is about 43.7%, while it's only 26.4% in the PP state. So that's a big difference. And let's remind ourselves that this is the use of the most effective optimal treatment to treat an OUD. And so there's a big difference in the type of treatment that women get depending on living in a PP or a not PP state. So conclusions that I can draw from these findings are that PPs really interact with other policies to produce complex effects. But when they're active in isolation, they reduce pregnant admissions to treatment facilities. And secondly, in all policy landscapes explored, PPs unequivocally suppress MAT use for all women of childbearing age, with even more suppression in low OTP states. So the policy implications that we should take from these findings are that we should really interpret these results with caution. So we don't want to be hasty and eagerly posit that PPs may intrinsically increase pregnant women's admission if we only look at the regressions without interactions, because it could be that something more complex is at play. For example, I showed the interaction term. PPs also may drive up demand for addiction treatment services first by increasing OUDs, and then subsequent PTPs being implemented may expand the supply for the treatment of pregnant women. So that could drive the increased dynamics in pregnant admissions. The second policy implication is that we should expand treatment incentives for pregnant women in PP-only states. So in 2020, which is the most recent year for which I had data, 10 states colored in orange here have a PP in isolation. And so it's in these states that PPs will experience a reduction, that pregnant admissions will experience a reduction of about 20.2%. And when you reduce admission of pregnant women into treatment programs, especially by such a large magnitude, it can exacerbate the opioid epidemic by leaving women untreated. And there's also the intergenerational prolongation of the opioid epidemic through neonatal abstinence syndrome. So severe ramifications are likely to arise from these drops in pregnant admissions. In this case, I think state legislatures ought to consider enacting policies and programs that incentivize women's admission into treatment facilities in the face of such a large drop in admissions. Then, just reiterating, a second policy implication should be that we should expand OTPs and MAT availability for women, because what I want these findings to indicate to you is that it's not just pregnant admissions that suffer impacts from punitive policies. And it's not just pregnant women that suffer these impacts. It's also PPPs impact the availability of the best medication, MAT, and they impact all women of childbearing age, irrespective of their pregnancy status. In 2020, 16 states had an active PP, the ones in pink here, and less than 5 OTP million inhabitants. In these states, it's all women that will experience reductions in MAT. And so these states may experience less effective management of the opioid epidemic, which may lead to persistent and perhaps increasing addiction rates over time. And then that means that these states could then be subjected to higher costs associated with managing higher rates of addiction from recurrent and relapsing cases that were ineffectively managed in the first place. So here I really want to point out that these punitive policies have collateral effects. So they affect all women, even though their justification is hinged on disincentivizing pregnant women from abusing opiates, they have implications for all women, so past their purview. The first extension, taking the data and the findings that I have here, I just want to point out that there's 6 states that are PP only and less than 5 OTPs. These are the dark red states on this map. And so maybe these are the states whose women face the most severe barriers to accessing treatment or to getting MAT. And so I think over time, studies would do well to pay attention to these 6 states, potentially monitoring infant and maternal health outcomes, and just seeing how their policy dynamics change over time. other directions for future research, aside from paying attention to those six critical states, I think we would do well to incorporate sequential policy dynamics into the models. So controlling for if a PP was implemented first and then a PTP or vice versa, just to try to parse out the dynamics there of increasing supply and demand for addiction treatment. I also think there could be a warrant for the use of time lag variables to explore the long lasting maternal and infant health effects. So, looking after many years, what does the implementation of these punitive policies do? And then I also think it would be interesting to look at the impacts on healthcare utilization costs. Potentially, if PPs do really exacerbate addiction rates, we could increase the healthcare utilization costs in those states. So, an analysis of that would be interesting. And so, key takeaways, just one big one that I want you to walk away with is that PPs beget severe repercussions on the effective management of all women's OUDs, generating ramifications past their supposed purview, which should make all of us question their justification and continued existence in the future. Thank you so much to IAS for the opportunity to present, and for all of you for listening today, and also to my professor, Kelly Noonan, and Quan Lee for their advising on this project. Thank you.